a terrible episode from a series of crimes of fascism. Mizak is a small town that was part of the Zdeblunovsky district of the Volyn voivodeship of the Second Polish Republic until 1939. The population of Mizak at the time of the attack by the Reich Army was no more than 3,000 people. More than half of them were Jews who settled there in the 19th century. The Poles lived there too. The population of the town was prosperous. Jewish families lived especially well, particularly those who owned industries and small factories such as mills, workshops, sawmills, oil presses, and those who were engaged in trade. But then June 22, 1941 came. Nazi Germany attacked the USSR. The Germans were at Mizak already 10 days after the start of the war. It was not so far from the border. In the town there was a small detachment of the Red Army reinforced by a squad of local volunteers. They together were going to give the Germans a fight. However, one of the local nationalists showed the Germans a bypass route through the forest around the mountain near the town. As a result, the German troops outflanked the defenders and attacked them from the rear. The battle did not last long. Almost all of the soldiers of the detachment died or were captured. Local authorities managed to evacuate themselves from the town, and with them about 100 Jewish families were also evacuated. In total, up to 300 people. The rest of the Jews did not want to leave their homes, just like the local Poles. Columns of German and Hungarian troops and equipment marched through Mizak for several days. The first thing the Germans did, having settled in Mizak, was to create a Gestapo department and begin to recruit a squad of policemen from local young nationalists. Then the new masters closed all the mills and shops. After a week of the Nazis' management, there was nothing to buy in the settlement, even matches or kerosene, as well as there was nowhere to grind grain for flour. On the other hand, leaflets in German were hung everywhere, in which the most mentioned word was shooting. Shooting for possession of weapons, shooting for resistance to representatives of the German authorities, shooting for helping Jews, etc. By the end of July, a Jewish ghetto was organized in Mizak. A part of the village was allocated for this. It was fenced off with a barbed wire, and police squads were deployed, who were supposed to ensure that the rest of the residents did not communicate with the Jews and did not help them. The entire Jewish population of Mizak, as well as Jews from neighboring villages, were herded into the ghetto during the summer and autumn of 1941. This fascist action was accompanied by widespread looting of the property of Jewish families. Some local residents also took part in the robbery. However, there were not many of them. Most local families condemned their fellow tribesmen for such acts, because for decades people lived there in peace and friendship. Some took risks helping the Jews as best they could. They donated bread and lard to the ghetto, although many themselves were already beginning to experience difficulties with food, since the Germans not only closed mills, creameries and shops, but also began to tax the population with food taxes. In fact, it just was illegal extortion. Local policemen usually turned a blind eye to their fellow villagers who helped Jews. But there were also ardent Nazis who swore at such people, even threatened with weapons and could have used them. So simple peasants, Sidor and Justina Sloboduk, who had a daughter Maria, hid their daughter's friend Sofia Gorstein for several months. One of the neighbors informed the national activist. They killed Sidor, but Justina with her daughter and a Jewish girl managed to hide in the forest under the protection of the partisans. In the ghetto, people found themselves in a difficult situation. Some of the prisoners were able to take with them only the most necessary things. People lived crowded together with several families in one dwelling. There was only one well with water in the ghetto. The situation with food was really bad. In the ghetto, people lived on what the local could pass on. Within a few months, famine set in the ghetto. Jews exchanged valuables, jewelry, and whatever they had with them with local policemen for food. Thus, the residents of the ghetto survived the winter, hand to mouth in cold dwelling. Since the Germans did not allow the preparation of firewood, they burned whatever they had, old supplies of firewood, furniture, etc. One of the local residents recalled that while passing by the ghetto he heard a familiar voice. Someone called out to him. The boy hardly recognized his teacher Bella Aronova, and when he found out, he was scared. A very thin, aged and gray-haired woman was looking at him. She was begging for bread. The boy ran home, hid bread under his clothes with a piece of bacon, put eggs in his pockets and brought them to the ghetto. But he did not meet the teacher, so he gave the food to the other prisoners. he never saw his teacher again. In total, there were 17 1,800 Jewish prisoners in the local ghetto, but not everyone survived the winter. By spring, the Germans, in addition to the livestock taken from the Jews, added some of the animals requisitioned from the remaining residents and set up something like a collective farm. They took away the land and forced the locals to work on it. Jews were also forced to work. However, due to the fatigue, they apparently were not the best workers. Those locals who refused to go to work were deported to Germany. People began to hide in the forest. Some nationalists were also sent to work in Germany, which surprised them greatly. But the Germans were not going to stand on ceremony even with the local Nazis, for the good of the Reich was above all. And then the nationalists and police split up. Some went into the forest to create their own resistance units, which in fact hid out until the arrival of the Red Army, preparing stashes and food supplies. Subsequently, the NKVD MGB Special Forces had a hard time catching this detachment out of the forest. Others began to serve the Nazis even more zealously, showing their loyalty and devotion in every possible way. The former landlord's estate, which had a hospital for residents, was first closed by the Germans, and then the hospital was reopened, although only for wounded Germans. At school, at first, only Germans were taught. Then the school was closed. Why waste time teaching subhumans? Meanwhile, the summer of 1942 ended. The German authorities decided not to leave the ghetto for the winter and to solve the Jewish question within the Mizak region. At the beginning of October, the Germans gathered all the Jews in the ghetto, allowed them to take with them only the most valuable things, if there was anything left at all, and led them towards the former sugar factory. They said that they would take them to Germany. However, some Jews realized that this was not true and tried to resist. A fire broke out in the ghetto. The Germans and policemen walked around and shot at everyone they found outside the column. According to the testimony of captured policemen, one little boy sat and cried near the corpse of his mother. The policeman came up and gave him a candy. Then he came from behind and shot the child in the back of the head. The Jews gathered in columns, which were taken to the sugar factory and driven into a ravine located outside the territory of the factory. They were kept there for 5 days without food or water. People licked grass in the morning to somehow quench their thirst. Mothers with their bodies warmed the children as best they could, since the nights were already cold. From all over the area, new groups of unfortunates were driven to the ravine. People burned branches, books, and their documents in order to somehow warm up. Then the Germans and police began to take the prisoners out in groups, forcing them to strip naked and lie down on the ground. The policemen took away the clothes. Cynically, without any emotion, they approached and shot people in the forehead or the back of the head. Then they brought the next batch and continued their bloody work. The policemen tried to curry favor and show their usefulness to the German masters. Therefore, they diligently performed the work of executioners. When the corpses accumulated, the prisoners were forced to cover them with earth. Then they were also forced to undress and lie down on their fellow countrymen sprinkled with earth, and the executioners continued the bloody reprisal. So, over the course of 2 or 3 days, more than 1,500 prisoners of the Mizak ghetto were shot. However, the terrible story of the Mizoch Ravine did not end there. During the autumn of 1942 and then the spring and summer of 1943, parties of Jews, captured partisans, communists and underground fighters were brought here and shot in a similar way. According to various sources, in total from 5,000 to 10,000 people were shot in this bloody ravine, including at least 100 local Poles who were killed in 1943. The Mizak shootings formed the basis of the indictment of the Ludwigsburg investigation. Photographs taken by the executioners themselves, eyewitness accounts and testimonies of captured policemen and assessmen helped in this. Thus ended the terrible story of the Mizak ghetto.